Hi, everybody. I can sort of see our panelist over here, but I'm going to, I just want to take a few moments and provide a few reflections and introduce our program tonight. My name's Joe Ferrara. I'm Vice President and Chief of Staff here at Georgetown. It's wonderful to welcome you all here for this latest installment in our Faith and Culture series, which has now been underway for, it's hard to believe, but almost 20 years. I'm here today on behalf of President DeGioia. Jack, many of you know Jack. Jack suffered a stroke in June of this year. He has been going through the process of recovery and rehabilitation, and we've been keeping the university going while he recovers. So I know he would have been here tonight if he could, but I'm very proud to be here on his behalf. I also want to thank, I see Tom Bancho over here, our director of the Berkley Center. I want to thank our Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs and the journalism program. I believe Rebecca's here somewhere, right there, for partnering with us on this gathering. Under Jack's leadership, Georgetown has sought to deepen opportunities for dialogue at the intersection of faith, culture, and society, including through this series, this special lecture series, which Paul Elie has been leading. Paul is a senior fellow at the Berkley Center and director of our American Pilgrimage Project. Since 2008, the Faith and Culture series has welcomed a number of distinguished writers and thinkers, all invested in ideas at the intersection of faith and culture. These have included filmmaker Martin Scorsese, novelist Marilynne Robinson and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, poets Christian Wyman and Tracy K. Smith, and earlier this year, journalist and biographer Jonathan Elie. This afternoon, we're grateful to welcome back to Georgetown acclaimed journalist, poet, and author Eliza Griswold to discuss her recent book, Circle of Hope, A Reckoning with Love, Power, and Justice in an American Church. As many of you know, Eliza has written across many genres and topics, from poetry and translation to long-form journalism on environmental activism, global politics, and interfaith relations. She has served as a contributing writer for The New Yorker since 2003, and this past August began as director of the program in journalism at her alma mater, Princeton University. Her first nonfiction book, The 10th Parallel, Dispatches from the Fault Line Between Christianity and Islam, was published in 2010, following 7 years of immersive reporting on religion, nationhood, and natural resources in Africa and Asia. Eliza is also the author of Amity and Prosperity, One Family, and the Fracturing of America, which received the 2019 Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of the natural gas fracking industry in southwestern Pennsylvania. Eliza's most recent book, Circle of Hope, which we will explore today, tells the story of a progressive evangelical church in Philadelphia. It's nearly 40 years of growth and its response to reckonings with racial injustice and the global pandemic. In sharing this story, the book examines, in the words of one recent review, how political disagreements can fracture even the closest friendships and break even the best institutions. Through its meticulous research and compelling narrative, Circle of Hope invites us to look inward and also to look around us, to center empathy even in our most divisive moments. Speaking about the book, Eliza said, and let me quote, "One of the things that I feel very strongly about as a teacher of journalism and as a journalist is that we really need to be crossing lines of difference. It is essential to the project of journalism. We need to understand people who are different than we are, and we need to allow them to be as fully human as they are and to articulate themselves without fitting into the boxes we imagine that they are supposed to fit into." Close quote. In the months since its release, and I believe Circle of Hope came out just this past August. Circle of Hope has already received significant recognition, which includes its recent nomination as a finalist for the National Book Award for Nonfiction. Eliza, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, sharing your insights and reflections with us. Joining Eliza in conversation is our own Paul Elie, distinguished author, editor, and longtime member of the Georgetown community. Paul, as I've mentioned, has facilitated our Faith and Culture series since the very beginning. Paul is the author of The Life You Save May Be Your Own, a portrait of 4 20th century Catholic writers, which won the Penn Martha Albrun Award for First Nonfiction, and Reinventing Bach. Both of these books were National Book Critics Circle Award finalists. His third book, which I'm really looking forward to, and he and I have discussed it several times, will be called The Last Supper, which will consider the intersection of religion and arts in the 1980s. And that book will be coming out in the spring, and we look forward to doing a book event for that too. In addition, Paul is a regular contributor to The New Yorker, which has published many of his writings on topics such as Catholicism, the Vatican, and Pope Francis. So let me get out of the way now. Paul, thank you so much for leading this conversation, and I'm going to turn it over now to Paul and Eliza. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thanks to colleagues from the Berkley Center and the journalism program who are here. It's very satisfying to see so many students here, and so many students from my courses in particular. It's neat to be in this different kind of dialogue with you today. And to be here with you, Eliza, is really something. We put our shoulders to the plow together on your first book, and then you were a guest at the Berkley Center. Your second book won a Pulitzer Prize, and you've been on our list for years and years, but you were off doing your thing, and one of the things you were doing was writing this book. So I'm glad you finished, and I'm glad it's out, and I'm glad that you're here. President DeJoy has wanted to have you here, I would say, for as long as we've had the series going, so it's very satisfying. Thank you.
Well, I'm so honored and delighted to be here with you, Paul, and just here to be here with all of you guys. And I want to say, everybody found a seat, but there's seats up front. I can see little people poking around. There's plenty of room up here.
So this book at hand, Circle of Hope, it's about a cluster of Christian congregations that have aggregated and done their thing for a quarter of a century in Philadelphia and Camden, New Jersey. And reading it, my first impression is I'm amazed that these people exist, because they run so counter to the narrative of so much of what we're told about American Christianity. How did you find them, and at what point did you realize this was you were going to do this?
So I found them through, I think, Paul, both you and I are lovers of the counter-narrative of American Christianity, right? So I, like many of us, the narratives of conservative evangelicalism and its capture of politics in America is an incredibly important story, but it's not the whole story of what evangelicalism is today, and certainly not what it's been historically. And I really wanted to look across the American religious landscape and broaden that lens a bit and hang out at the edge of evangelicalism, where since the Jesus freaks, since the 60s, we've seen movements of progressive evangelicals who really harken back to earlier, to the 17th and 18th century idea that yes, you give your life to Christ and you believe completely, but you also transform society around you, that you live according to bringing the kingdom of heaven into earth. And these guys are social justice. They're embedded in a culture of social justice. They're heavily tattooed, and I met them because I was with one of their sort of I call him an evangelical superstar, but this guy, Shane Claiborne, who's a wonderful guy who was melting down guns to melt them into garden tools to live out the biblical injunction to beat swords into plowshares. And we were in Philadelphia, and he was sort of poking the barrel of an AK-47 into a mobile forge to melt it. And I could see behind him there was a certain kind of person, earnest, again, covered in tattoos, piercings, but very kind of thrift store chic, what I call a modern Mennonite beard, just kind of clipped and hip, but devout. And I said, who are those guys? And Shane said, that's my church. And I knew right away that I wanted to, I didn't know I would write a book about them, but I knew that I wanted to spend some time in this community to give Americans a very different understanding of what it meant to be Bible believing than we sometimes see in images on the right.
So you just said, spend some time in this community, and that's complicated, right? The book radiates commitment, the commitment of these believers to living in a certain way, and then the commitment that you have to entering into their lives, entering into their heads, their points of view, and entering into the quotidian, their Zoom meetings, their prayers, their bake sale, so to speak. I mean, how do you get from, I'm going to spend some time with them, to the incredible undertaking that the book represents? So
in some ways by accident, that's how that happens. But after meeting them, I met one pastor, and there were 4 pastors at the time, 4 current pastors, and then the founders of the church who were in the background and sometimes not so much in the background of the church. And that was already becoming a problem by the time I arrived. So I went to one of their Monday morning pastors' meetings and laid out what I wanted to do. And the book that I wanted to, that I did this, Immersive Journalism, they were familiar. I'm a Philly girl. They knew my work a little bit. One of them really wanted to be better known, and Johnny, one of the 4 pastors. So he was all in on this project, and with varying degrees of enthusiasm, they all said yes, because they make collective decisions, and they believed that the Spirit was leading them to say yes, and that by allowing them their story to be told, they were not trying to draw people into their church particularly, but they were trying to do what I hope the book would do as well, which was signal that this movement existed, and for the tens of millions of young people who are leaving their churches in America, there might be another way. These guys were celebrating and devoted to another way to find and follow Jesus. Jesus was at the center of their lives, and yet that didn't look like so many of the churches that I was familiar with. So they were willing to participate for the greater good, really. Now this was the summer and fall of 2019. None of us had any idea what was coming. The church really was completely anti-megachurch vibes. So no screens, no smoke machines, no high production values. You were incarnate, you were in the flesh, in your group, in your congregation, and in these small groups called cells. So what happened is that the pandemic changed that radically, and then George Floyd brought them to start to ask questions about who they were inside the church that were incredibly painful to answer.
And to read the book is to have a front row seat at all this. Yes, the Zoom meetings, but people taking a walk out in the park and praying, people baking cross cookies that they're going to be served at 5 o'clock in the morning on Easter Sunday. And I'm reading this thinking, is she there? So you tagged along for all those activities?
Yeah, I was there. I mean, that's the thing about immersion. If you got to be careful about who you pick, because if your people are up at 5 in the morning, you're there at 5 in the morning. So yeah, so there were what the book I already can see in a classroom. So immersion journalism, as I describe in the book, is like going up to somebody's driving the car of their life, and you knock on the window and you say, can I get in the back seat and ride along? And they say, sure, I'm going to Boston to a conference in illuminated manuscript. And you're like, great. And then you get in the car, and 7 years later, you're in Vegas, and the car is like on fire, and they're like, what happened to my life? And so I'm used to that. I've done that a lot, like where you just follow in real time where someone's life is leading for different stories, and sometimes for up to many years. This was different in that it was 4 of them, and that the terms of their lives changed so radically, so that the story I intended, the story we had almost contracted or come together, agreed to tell together, was not the story that unfolded. And so a lot of what happens in the book, and I wonder if that has something to do with the aliveness of it, is this space, but they allowed me to continue to follow them. Even though it was incredibly painful, and they were swearing at one another on Zoom meetings, turning off their screens, fighting, and asking existential questions of whether or not they could remain a church.
So let's park that for a minute, the what happened. Now, my undergraduate sense of immersion journalism is that part of it comes out of field work or anthropology, which prizes a certain sort of detachment in the observation. And I guess what's striking to me about this book is that it is not detached in the way that we're accustomed to from so much journalism, where this band of Christians will be described as specimens of expressions of a certain social energy. There's an intellectual and theological immersion. You speak their language, their imagery of the gospel, and swords into plowshares and loaves and fishes and so forth becomes the warp and woof of the book, so that we're right up there in their souls or in their worldview in a way that I can't think of a book like it. How intentional was that to really kind of speak Christian?
So Paul, Paul was the editor of my first book in the most profoundly beautiful way, and I just have to say just for a minute that the end of my first book, it was a little bit dry and a little bit disjointed, this book, and Paul said, isn't there anybody in your notebooks who maybe really feels this more deeply? And the end of the book is completely Paul's. So this kind of juiciness of lived faith, of praxis, right? But where's the soul on the page? I think you're a practitioner and reader for this. So there is a lot of soul on the page in this book in a way that is new for me, and I didn't know how to put less of myself. There was no putting less of myself in the book than these people were putting into their lives to live it. And they did. So the book is told from 4 points of view, and it doesn't say this anywhere, but the joke is instead of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's Johnny, Rachel, Julie, and Ben, right? So it's one story told in 4 perspectives. It repeats. It's sometimes confusing. How are we seeing, this scene, I understood it to be one way. Now I'm reading it in another section, and an entirely different thing is happening. And that's all deliberate, because I didn't know. The idea of subjectivity runs deeply through this book. These guys each of these pastors is living, it's not like having a fight. Like many of my friends who had nothing to do with church like this book, because they're like, same thing happened in the Audubon Society or in my block community. These questions about race and power and privilege dominated and continue to dominate our lives for great reasons. But this book is different in that these guys are living, they have given their souls to living how Jesus, and asking on a daily basis how Jesus wants them to live. And so many of them have left behind conservative childhood churches and a kind of theology that they were read into at birth, where they believed definitely that following Jesus looked like one thing. They've rejected that, they've moved to the city, and they've left their church without leaving Jesus. They've found a new community, a chosen family, and now that is under pressure as well. And that is excruciating for them. That is a level of existential crisis. I mean, I have done a lot of my work in war zones as a journalist. This crisis is no less painful and existential than being in a life or death struggle for them. And so I think walking alongside that through them. They're with them. There was no way to back up. And also some of what they lived, and this is painful for them now, it's not pretty. And the way to deal with difficult actions and things they've said and done is to go all in with the kind of compassion and devotion that they try to offer one another.
You can feel it in the book, and just a little context. So these conservative Christians, many of them, they come to tough neighborhoods in Philadelphia, multiracial neighborhoods that are under pressure from drugs on the one hand and gentrification on the other. So there's an open-air drug den, and then the church is populated by, what did you call it, mansplainers and pork pies, where there's a kind of hipster style going around. And then the church is seized by the question of whether it's walking the walk of Jesus' love when it comes to racial justice. And that question seems to come partly from the gospel, partly from the moment, and partly from what we Catholics used to call scrupulosity, where you kind of like fuss over every word and every intention as a sign of your faith.
Yeah.
That some mix like that is culture, church, and Bible all together pressing on them.
Yeah, I mean, and generational tensions. So the church is founded by, hippie Southern California, Rod and Gwen White is their name, this white family from California. They're Jesus freaks. They've been living in a commune. They come to, during the 90s, they come to Philadelphia. They believe Jesus is calling them to minister to young people, to bring people in. They don't even want to call Circle of Hope a church at first. They're groovers. They set up, they plant churches. They're church planters, above like the Korean deli. They take over spaces. They believe that they are colonizing, that is the language, the last places of empire. They believe they are decolonizers is what they think, right? That they're pulling apart. For a period of time, they don't even shower because they believe that Western hygiene is American empire. And so they're anarcho-primitivists. So they stop showering because they cast off Western hygiene. I mean, they are all in. And eventually what happens, so that is like the founders are boomers, and there are lots of Gen Xers. That's kind of the pork pie mansplainers are of my generation. And now there's a younger generation. There's a millennial generation that says, you guys, what you've been doing is in colonizing the places and saving and occupying the places of empire is also white saviorism. Now they know that, they're aware of what they're doing. They're aware that in a city that is 50% white and 50% black, their church is 85% white, right? And they have different explanations for why that is. And basically what happens is in 2019 and 2020, the question is asked, can this church stand anymore? What is wrong with us? And you guys who've been looking outside, looking for the ills of the world and healing them in Jesus' name and throwing yourselves all into your Narcan project, are you looking within? Are you really aware of where your own white supremacy lies? Because it's time that we do that work. And it's that tension between the outside and the inside, the generations and all that you mentioned, and power and leadership that come to bear in the book.
You mentioned, I think you used the word trauma, and you compared it to what you saw in Afghanistan. It is a hothouse. You feel in this book these conflicts being related from 4 different points of view, and by the third time through, I mean, it's really intense.
It's intense.
And then there's a certain point, at what point did you realize this church is breaking up?
So there's a fifth character, main character, Bethany Stewart, in the book, and she's a young black woman in Philadelphia, and she foresaw the breakup of the church a couple of years before the end of the church actually came. And one day she was in her garden in back of her house, and she thought, the church needs to split up. And she told me that at that time. So I was aware that, well, that's an interesting proposition, because so much, certainly of the kind of church that I was raised in, the idea of togetherness, like, what are you doing? You've got to stay together. And you could take the question of church out of it and think of it as a community. Like, if the value of community, is it togetherness? Or is it that we atomize and go with people who believe what we believe? Like, these are the questions of our time. So Bethany believed that the time had come for the church to kind of pull apart and people to go their own ways. And for the pastors who had been shepherding this community, that idea was terrifying. So it took a while for them to begin to detangle from one another.
The book is really substantially about then the drama of these pastors as they figure out whether, how, and when to extricate themselves from this thing they've given their lives to. And in the prologue, you point out that this is not unlike what your father witnessed at firsthand with the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Communion a generation ago. Can you explain that and how that actually came to bear on you as a writer dealing with this particular story?
Yes. So, I mean, I think part of the reason so in 2003, when the Episcopal Church first consecrated its first openly homosexual bishop, that was Gene V. Robinson. And my dad was the presiding bishop at the time. And so it was his job to go through with the Diocese of New Hampshire had elected him and to consecrate him. And to do that, my dad wore a bulletproof vest because the idea was, now this was at a time of like militant Islam was everywhere, everyone was terrified of it, but it wasn't that some terrorist was going to come out of the congregation to attack Dad for doing something against God. It was that some fellow Christian, right, was going to say that this act is against God. And that...
Because the church had been against homosexuality for so long.
Because, yeah, well, I don't know that the church had been awake to the issue of homosexuality, right? So those who believed that homosexuality was evil were confronted with the reality that God's love was going to be much larger in this church than it had been. Now, as a result of that action, the church went through a modern-day schism, and it was pretty surreal. Let's see, 2003. I was in my 20s watching this happen, and I was just becoming a reporter at the same time, and I was starting to report on evangelicals. And I found myself in Sudan with Franklin Graham for the first book, Billy Graham's son. And when Franklin Graham's number 2 said to me, well, where are you from? And I said I was from Philadelphia, but that's not really what he meant by asking that question. He meant, what is your religious background? And I said, well, this is who my dad is. And so I ended up praying with Franklin Graham and talking to, this was new to me, evangelicalism, talking about why people felt so strongly about homosexuality and why Franklin Graham said, well, that comes for the Episcopal Church, that kind of cultural clash comes for the Episcopal Church, but obviously not for evangelicals because we are true believers, right? The Episcopal Church has fallen already. And what I could see, I feel like I had a front row seat to the culture wars coming for Christianity in our period of time, right? Because I saw this unfolding at home. I saw churches fighting over property because that's what happened in the Episcopal Church. Who owns the church? And, does the new group own it? Does the old group? I watched all of this, and I watched the tremendously high stakes for my dad, where here was a pretty reserved dude who was crying at the kitchen table. His favorite thing that he did was he used to go meet with the Pope. He was the head of some Marian dialogue. And he was excommunicated from that because of this, and he could no longer go back, and that was excruciating for him. So I think the personal cost that we pay to live our faith, that people pay to live their faith is something I've watched live, but it's in the book also because the lens through which I look cannot be separated from that's one way in which I think we need to kind of update our understanding. Immersion journalism is often called like fly on the wall. Like it's like, I'm just a disembodied, I'm just watching this. Like I'm watching all of this with the lens through which I look at the world, which is deeply formed by what I have experienced and what I've seen. So that story is in the book to give that kind of context to why I am doing this work a little bit.
And then, so all that happens, you're reporting from Asia, from Africa, eventually from Afghanistan. I think at one point you had been to Afghanistan and you said to me, Paul, my next reporting is going to be in the United States. And I mean, what's it like to have logged that time in Afghanistan and reporting in Kabul with translators and fixers, and suddenly to do it in a part of Philadelphia? Is it more the same or more different?
Well, it comes out of, there's an awesome old editor of Granta magazine, Ian Jack. And so Ian Jack, I went to see him when I was reporting in war zones around the world, looking at, social justice issues. And he said to me, why is it American reporters are always going around the world to look at the problems that everyone is suffering from? And I was like, gulp. And that was, and that was why I came back to the United States quite explicitly. And the book that I wanted to write that became my last project was about crumbling infrastructure. And I was really into, like, how do we not look at our social safety nets? We don't take care of what connects us. I wanted to write about bridges, and I ended up in Pittsburgh writing about fracking. This often happens to me, right? So
lucky for us.
Well, and for this story, I just knew that we needed to have a serious conversation about faith that I was beyond the cliches that I myself was writing. I mean, if I don't have to, unfortunately, I have to write the word Christian nationalism many more times because it's part of the reality, but it's not the whole reality. And so as a journalist, I think my responsibility is to make sure I'm not distorting an image by writing about it.
What about the how of writing about religion? I know in my own work I'm guided by a strong sense of either what other people aren't doing or what they're doing wrong that I want to do differently, or by what's needed, how to tell my people's story in a way. On a structural level, there's 4 pastors, it ends at Easter. You've made very considered decisions about that Christianity isn't going to be offset with kind of ironizing, detaching worldly language. There's gospel adages at the head of every chapter. How much kind of formal and structural intentionality do you bring to this is how religion ought to be written about?
0, which is maybe not the right answer, but I am an intuitive to a fault writer. Like, the epigraph for the book is the first 2 lines of the Sermon on the Mount, right? Which is, see,
Blessed
that's
are
how
the poor.
before the Beatitudes. It's okay. You guys are awfully quiet, I have to say. I'm used to a little laughing instead. That's just crickets out there. Okay. All right. Zoinks, now I've called it out and I have to find it. Okay. So now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to speak and he began to teach them. He said, and then the book. Because I think it's alive. I think these people are living their own gospel. I mean, that's a big thing to say. Watching them do their best to live out their devotion is certainly as legitimate as people running around the Holy Land following. Like, this is their gospel, right? This is the best they can do. And so this is their aim toward being larger, not larger than they are in a personal sense, not all of them, but giving themselves to something greater. And I hope, and that's kind of what I just followed that. And honestly, it was so confusing for a while, the fighting, and it was so tough that all I could be like is, okay, what happens next? Just write that down. Just write that down. But there were a lot of ethically complicated questions about that because a lot of it is pretty tough. And it's not pretty, and they say terrible things to one another, and they do kind of crappy things behind one another's back, and they scheme, and they politic, and they insult one another, and that was really hard. And I think one thing that I hope that the book does, early on, a pastor read it, and she said, she did some math for what they're paid. They're paid very little, and at one point, they were spending, one of them, Julie, was spending like 15 hours on the phone a day, counseling people through this. And she's like, she did the math, I think it was $72 if that, 72 cents an hour that Julie was earning doing that job. So I think one thing that I hope the book serves is that it's a book about what we ask our pastors to do, and our priests, and our clergy, and probably our professors, but that's less my experience. But we ask them to be the plumber, the psychologist, the Uber driver. These guys do a lot, and they've given themselves to everyone around them, and the cost of that is high. And I think that is what the book's about as much as it's about anything else.
So we have some time for questions. I want to ask one more while people get their questions together, and the microphone, people with microphones look for those who are ready to ask questions. Because the book is so centrally about religion, and because this is a series that deals with faith and culture, it's easy to just keep talking about religion. But obviously this book sits in a whole field of other books and influences that you've been drawing on. Can you identify a few of those? Who are your kin in this kind of work?
Who are my kin in this? That's an interesting one. Who are my kin in this kind of work? Well, I'll mention another book that's just come out that's very good, that's very different and weirdly structurally similar, which is a book called Undivided by Hari Hahn. I would suggest that people read that. It's about a different kind of racial justice program. There are certain religion reporters who are my kin. Like Religion News Service is just so wonderful. And nobody, in the mainstream media, people are like, what is that? And they're just fantastic reporters. But in terms of writers, religion writers I don't really read religion writers.
I was thinking about, I watched you have a completely different conversation with Jodi Kantor, the author of She Said.
Yeah.
And it just made me see your work in a completely different way, because it's all the questions of journalism and commitment and sources, and very little was said about faith. It was all about how you get the story. And I don't want to leave that question unasked.
Well, I think, to be honest, Paul, working with you early on, and certainly your incredible way in which you worked with me, but your gentle call to bringing a full human of faith to the page deeply informs how I work, and that's just true.
I see the connection now that you mentioned this figure at the end of the 10th Parallel. It's a remarkable story, and go to the book to find it. But now that you've mentioned it, from him to these four, it makes perfect sense. Questions from people in the audience? Right here.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. My name is Grace. I'm a journalism student here at Georgetown. We read your piece on Black men voting for Kamala Harris for class, and I was wondering how you go about reporting on marginalized communities as a white woman.
Okay, so first I would say that sadly that piece was probably best titled Black Men Not Voting for Kamala Harris, which is something we will all be reckoning with in the days to come. So because I've done this for such a long time, I'm pretty comfortable having any explicit conversation about power and representation with whoever I'm working with. The person at the center of that is actually somebody who I often wondered while I was writing this book if I should have written a book about him, Nicholas O'Rourke, who's a pastor and a city councilman in Philadelphia. He belongs to a third party called the Working Families Party. So that's, the first scene of that was pretty incredible to me, because I was sitting in a black barber shop as black men talked to one another about terms and race, a lot of which I did not even put in the piece, because it felt to me, I did not feel comfortable telling aspects of that story. I didn't feel entitled to tell stories. So I think the question isn't where, so first of all, I'll say reporting requires crossing lines of difference, requires. So we don't stay within our own demographic. We could do that and write a memoir, right? So that is part of the ethical mandate. And I want to say that so clearly because I think at this time we have this, oh wait, do I have the right to cross that line? And we have that obligation as journalists. So that, why don't I start there, and then, does that sort of answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. A little bit rambly, but I can talk to you more after if you want to talk about it too.
Hi, I'm Mahati. I'm a global human development student at SFS. So I'm Indian and I'm not Christian, so my experience of Christianity is fully sort of focused on literature and pop culture. But my own experience of religion has been complicated, and I wanted to ask for those of us perhaps harmed by some iteration of religion, how do we approach sort of the larger question of religion, and in this case, Christianity, and how do you sort of, what you were talking about in bridging that gap?
So, just so I'm sure, so if you've suffered harm around religion, how do you then relate to it? Is that your question? It's a big one. Lots of the people in this book believe that they suffered harm at the hands of this church or at the church they have come from, right? So the notion in America of spiritual abuse is a live one. I think that would be a personal question, and I would say that not an alone question, right? How do you not return to a harmful space? And there's no need to do that without the proper support to do that. But I'm not sure I'm qualified to truly answer that question.
Hi, I'm Opal. I'm also a journalism student with Grace. And reading that piece, I felt a lot of similarities and parallels between the kind of political disillusionment you were talking about and the same kind of disillusionment I see with the media. Mm-hmm. So my question to you is, as a journalist, how do you approach situations where the subject of your story doesn't necessarily have faith in the media, and how do we as journalists, how should we be working to reinstill faith in the media?
Mm-hmm. So that's a great question. So it's very common for me, especially in this season, especially I do most of my work deliberately in Pennsylvania. And so there's a great deal of distrust and mistrust of the media. What was so interesting to me about this story about black men voting for Kamala or not was I am very familiar with kind of white rural conspiracy theory, how that works. I am not familiar in black spaces of how the same conspiracy theory is playing out. And that was surprising to me, to hear how disenfranchisement in this other community flourished in the same way. The same weird narratives about the doomsday clock and, vaccines. It was interesting to hear how that happened. I think in terms of restoring faith in the media, the truth is being honest and careful with one's work, right? And not assuming a greater level of knowledge or sophistication than the people that we're writing about, because this is especially true in rural Pennsylvania. But the idea of going out and shaking one's finger at rural Pennsylvanians and saying, you've signed this oil and gas lease, you're being exploited, that I understand the nature of how somebody is being exploited better than they do, is often wrong, right? So by virtue of showing up to listen and really listening and allowing oneself to be surprised and carrying that surprise over to the page. What is it about this person or this experience that has taught me something that's really surprising and very human? my experience has been that people respond to stories that are told in that manner and feel honored by them.
Hi, my name is Sophia, and I'm a student at Georgetown, and I actually grew up 20 minutes south of Camden. So I was just curious how, in your book, how the city of Philadelphia influenced the way that this church operated, and maybe more generally how like cities or specific locations can impact the way that religion is practiced, or like how religion can impact the culture of a city.
That's another interesting one. So part of the way in which cities have impacted this kind of conservative, the kids who were in this church, they're not kids anymore, but was that kids would come from rural communities to go to college in Philadelphia, which has a long-standing history of Anabaptism and Quakerism and other, basically, other sects of belief in Christianity. But they also have all of these institutions, Messiah College and Eastern University. So there were places and people asking questions about what social justice that kind of blew people's minds. And there's a podcast called Saved by the City, which kind of speaks to this, right? Like I come to the city, and maybe you guys have had you have had this experience coming to college, like this period of deconstruction, right? What is it to question what I was raised with? Maybe it's not only about religion, it's also a cultural question. You know, what was I taught to value that I don't value anymore? That's a really valuable experience, a coming of age experience, and part of individuation is to scrutinize what we've received and reject what no longer serves us. So cities allowed, Philadelphia in particular, allowed for this kind of more rural community, this period of transit, right? And Camden in particular, did you have a question about Camden?
More generally about like Philadelphia, yeah.
I saw a quote today on my Instagram, and it was from a pastor in Brooklyn, and his name's Jose Humphreys, and he's very cool, and he was in an old story of mine, and he said something like, if the poor in the community around a church don't have good things to say about that church doesn't belong in that community, which I just thought, that's kind of cool.
Hello, my name is Luis. I'm a sophomore in the college studying government and Spanish. I'm also part of the journalism program. I'm really curious to hear you speak a little bit more about the narrative structure of this book.
Sure.
Specifically, was there a specific point in this investigative process where you said, oh, okay, I have to split this up into multiple different sections, or I wouldn't do the story justice if I didn't represent multiple different perspectives? Or was it just kind of, I'd love to mimic what the Gospels present the
I knew
narrative?
the story, the whole thing is they disagree so fundamentally about the nature of truth that I knew that there was no way to tell the story as soon as they started to disagree. First I thought, well, maybe there are 4 congregations, and I thought, well, maybe the idea of the last question of how does place influence church, and they're cool, they're in Camden, they're in Fishtown, they're in Germantown, they're in cool neighborhoods. So I thought, well, maybe place is the organizing principle for this narrative. And then when the disagreements became so profound, I realized there's no way to objectively narrate this fight in this room or this pastor's meeting right now. I need to allow each of these guys to articulate it from their own points of view, right? Which I did by, so the process, how does that work? How do you do what we call earning interiority on a page? It's pretty easy. It looks like, oh, how could that person possibly know what's being thought? Like, how can you get inside somebody's head? It's not difficult. When you call that person 10 minutes after the meeting and say, when you said X, what were you thinking? What were you feeling? You can ask questions that can be fact-checked, that are factually accurate about people's interior experiences, and put them on the page. That's just one of the novelistic tools available to writing long-form narrative nonfiction that is truly transformative.
Hi, I'm David Hollenbach. I teach here at Georgetown and a fellow of the Berkley Center. So I'm very interested. You mentioned that you got involved in this because you wanted to investigate how religion is not always the same as some of the stereotypes we have about what religion looks like. We have this image of religion today as basically being very right-wing and very Trumpy and all of that sort of thing. And you're suggesting that you were trying to find an alternative. And you found some radicals, but then they split up. And what can we learn, do you think, about, I haven't read the book yet, so I'm looking forward to reading it. But what can we learn about where religion is going in this country? Are there any generalizations that you draw from the experience you have with this community or these communities and its struggles about where religion could go or is going in this country? And I'm interested to know what you think about that.
So that's a difficult one, because no, there are not those generalizations in the book. And I have some thoughts about it outside of the book, but most are about restoring accuracy of the story that's unfolding now. Where we're going, I don't know. What's happening now that I think the mainstream media gets wrong is we have this whole category we assume of nuns, right? N-O-N-E-S. And the press, the mainstream press often thinks that means the whole world is becoming more atheistic, right? Like we're leaving God behind. And the truth is, I think that does a disservice to the understanding. People are leaving their churches and communities of faith, but they aren't leaving behind their religion. Many of them are leaving behind those communities to find a more authentic way to practice their belief in God, right? So the categories that Pew asks, for instance, I think are just outdated. There's no polling for black evangelicals. We just call them black Protestants. So how can you possibly understand what's happening in evangelicalism in America properly, demographically, if you're not even we're using old terms. So that's more a description of what's happening, a prognostication about now, right, than it is in the future. And I can't answer your question. At least you're not asking me who's going to win the election, which I couldn't answer either.
Last question. No, please.
So I'm Francie. I'm a student reporter here at Georgetown. And I wanted to ask, because I think sometimes to me, campus journalism feels a lot like immersive journalism. You're living with the people you're writing about. And I often find myself not for any kind of ideological agreement or bias, but I find myself in my writing oftentimes sanding off people's rough edges, portraying students in ways that not necessarily I know that they want to be portrayed, but in ways that are maybe, while still honest, a little bit smoother than what is actually happening. And I think when you were speaking about the process of immersive journalism, I was thinking how does she handle that, and that tension between wanting to be incredibly empathetic to the messiness and how painful this is for people, while also wanting to be true to the messiness of it on the page. So I kind of wanted to ask how you think about that. I don't know if it's an ethical dilemma, I don't know if it's an affective dilemma, but how you sort of think about those questions, both while you're reporting, but then also later on while you're writing.
Okay, that's a fantastic question. And that is a lot of the question of the book, right? It's not a question while reporting. Never question yourself while reporting, just report, right? Be the camera as much as you can, get everything you can. Don't worry about the ethics of it. I mean, there are many ethical questions you ask while you're reporting, but don't worry, should I include this? Should I not include this? Should I write it down? Get it all. And then there's a great process that goes on that absolutely, so the way in which I do this process is that I write a draft, and then I read it when it's in final form to the person. I started this with the Amity Project because I realized I was writing, so we talk about in journalism, we talk about we talk about sophisticated sources, like the ambassador. So if the ambassador says to you, well, I murdered somebody last night, you're like, you did it, right? But if an 8-year-old says something similar that implicates them, that is not a sophisticated source, right? So you want to treat that information differently. The same comes with representation with immersion on the page. So when in my last book, I realized that I really had to read the book aloud to the woman who was at the center of it, because she really didn't understand. Yes, she knew that she'd seen me write down that she had 4 bras and the clasp was broken on one, but did she really understand that that was going to be in the book and how that was going to be in the book? So we established clear ground rules of like, okay, I'm going to read this to you. I'm not asking you, please do tell me if there are factual inaccuracies. If something makes you super uncomfortable, you're welcome to tell me. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to take it out or not, right? That's not a decision you and I are going to have and make right now. And that taught me a lot. That process taught me a lot. And now it's something that I do with all long immersive projects. So, but the ethics are mine, because it's like, if I don't have the courage to read to somebody what I've written about them F-bombing or screaming in their Prius, or like their complicated relationship with their dad, do I have the right to write it? To the smoothing out of rough edges, that's a really good question, and I kind of have to think about that for a while. There was a certain degree, you probably haven't read the book yet, there's some ugly behavior in here, and there's some gossip, and there's some kind of politicking that's ugly. And I included it, even though it was difficult to do so. And I was worried that people would lose, as much as I was worried about misrepresentation, I knew it was accurate. I was also worried that people would lose their love and compassion for the person. The last thing I'll say is that what draws us to characters we read about, is not their perfection, it's their imperfection. And so I know that, right? I know that nobody wants the perfect victim. Like, we're done with that. Like, we don't read people who are just glossed over. So I could talk about this for hours. It's a great, great question. And I think try not to do it. Try to be accurate, at least in your notes. And so when you move from the note to a draft, and you start removing things, you understand why you're doing it.
I'm learning so much from this on the spot. Thank you. Let's carry on at the reception. There's books available for sale and signing. Colleagues in journalism at the Berkley Center, students, thank you so much. Thank you, Joe Ferrara. And thank you, Eliza Griswold.
Oh, thank you.